Good evening, everyone. My name is Matt Albertson. I'm the co-chair with the Connie Mack Dick Allen SABR chapter in Philadelphia. And with us this evening is Dennis Snelling. He is the author of a upcoming book on the Whiz Kids, and he'll speak to us about the Whiz Kids this evening. Just a quick background on Dennis. He's been a baseball fan since the age of 8 and is proud to have caught a foul ball off the bat of Padres infielder Fernando Gonzalez at San Diego Stadium in 1978. He's a three-time finalist for the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year for The Greatest Minor League in 2011, Johnny Evers, A Baseball Life in 2014, and for Lefty O'Doul, Baseball's Forgotten Ambassador in 2017. In addition, Johnny Evers was a 2015 Seymour Medal finalist, and in August 2024, he will begin his 51st season as the public address announcer for Downey High School in Modesto, California, and consults for school districts in business services after retirement as an associate superintendent in Roseville, California. Brought to you straight from your Amazon author page. So there's the bio. Dennis, thanks again for joining us this evening to talk about a team that is still near and dear to the heart of diehard Philadelphia baseball fans.
Oh, thank you
And
for
I
having me.
will let you take it away. Before that, if everybody could mute your mic, and then we'll do Q&A afterwards. Thanks a lot.
Sure. One note on my Fernando Gonzalez foul ball. What's interesting is my college roommate at the time is still my best friend. The next year at Candlestick Park, caught a foul ball off the bat of Fernando Gonzalez, and we were sitting next to each other both times. So really odd, but Fernando Gonzalez didn't play that long to hit that many foul balls. Um, so the Whiz Kids, when I've done some biographies, I've done histories of leagues. This is probably the first one that I've done of a franchise, and the way the book is structured is the very first chapter is called a. Actually, I have to read it because it's a pretty long. I was trying to be funny, so but it's called A Not Always Concise, but Nonetheless Relatively Brief History of Philadelphia Baseball from its beginnings, with a particular emphasis on the trials and tribulations of the Philadelphia Phillies up to and through 1942. And so that's kind of what the first chapter is taking you up to the point where uh, talking about the important parts of Philadelphia baseball history. Philadelphia is really an epicenter for early baseball. You had the National Association team actually took a tour to Britain along with the Boston Ball Club in 1874. And you had some great moments back there. You had a great little, a beautiful ballpark that was built at one time that then burned down and was replaced by Baker Bowl. You had an outfield where the only time in Major League history that three outfielders of all three starters hit 400, and Ed Delahanty, Sam Thompson, and Billy Hamilton. And they actually didn't lead the team in hitting. There was a fourth outfielder, Tuck Turner, which probably a lot of you already know this, who actually led the team. So you had some great players, some teams in the 1890s that they were really had a lot of Hall of Famers, but just never kind of got over the hump. They were always good, but the Phillies always drew in the 1890s. They were always usually first or second in attendance. And that changed kind of when the Athletics came. Phillies hit some hard times, went through some interesting ownership changes. Um, People like Horace Fogel, who left the game saying that he was going to ruin all the rest of baseball. He never really did that, but he gave it the old college try, I guess. And he was actually a front man. There were other people owning other teams who actually owned the Phillies at that point in time. That got uncovered as well. And then you went through William Baker, of course, and then the Nugents, who were pretty good judges of talent, actually, but just didn't have the money to run the team. And so that led to there were two major deals. The Nugents were kind of forced to sell the team in 42, and it came down to two offers. One, Jack Kelly, who's Grace Kelly's father, who was a Philadelphia politician and had some connections, and put an offer. And then William Drought Cox, who had been an owner in the failed American Football League and that was really his only professional experience in sports. And they ended up taking his offer, and he lasted a year, was banned from baseball until yesterday uh, for gambling, and famously went through some battles with he had hired Bucky Harris. Um, and that's really the second chapter gets into when William Cox took over and was forced then after that year to sell the team to the Carpenters, Robert Carpenter Sr., who turned the team over to his son, Robert Jr. And Robert Jr. hired a family friend, Herb Pennock, the Hall of Fame pitcher, as general manager. And together, actually, Robert Jr. was actually still in the Army at the time in 1944, so he would come on leave, but basically he tried. He was still involved, and Herb Pennock hired Joe Reardon to run the farm system, who had a pretty good connection, was a pretty solid guy. They hired some good scouts, and basically decided they were going to build a farm system from scratch, which was really from scratch because most of the minor leagues had shut down during World War II. So the second chapter kind of deals with that and some of the first Whiz Kids that were signed, kind of calling Bob Jr. in some ways the first Whiz Kid, but then the signings of Richie Ashburn and Granny Hamner. Del Ennis had already signed but came back from the war. He'd actually signed under the Nugents, and was actually promoted just prior to the war, but never played for Philadelphia. Instead, went off to the war and then came back afterwards and played. And Andy Seminick was another one that was already in place. So then the third chapter kind of deals with the signings of Curt Simmons and Robin Roberts, which was sort of the linchpins of the pitching staff, of course. I'm always fascinated with beginnings and endings, and I think you'll see the way this book is constructed. A lot of it is about the beginnings and endings. And so the first third of the book is really about those beginnings up through the 1949 season. There's a chapter, the 1949 season is kind of cut in half, um, with one half leading up to the Waitkiss shooting and the other after that, the aftermath of that. Then the 1950 season is kind of the middle part of the book, chapter 7 through 10, dealing with the season, the World Series. And then the rest of the book is really kind of the aftermath of that. So what happened after? Why didn't they repeat? Eddie Sawyer's problems and trying to keep the team together, uh, injuries backing up, issues with signing uh, bonus babies that in the 40s it worked and in the 50s it didn't. Their failure to look at Negro League players until it was too late, until they'd pretty much been picked over. Not hiring a general manager till 1954, um, after Herb Pennock's death in 1948, before the 48 season. So it kind of gets into what happened, the relationship between uh, the community and the Phillies, both the black community and the white community. And, why a lot of it is kind of the question of why the team didn't repeat. What happens? You have a window of opportunity for a team to become a dynasty, and why doesn't it? You know, there's a lot of teams that have opportunities. We're seeing it in basketball right now, where some really good teams are getting bounced out. And there's all sorts of reasons for it. Could be injuries, maybe there's weaknesses exposed. But what, you know, what is a singular event? How do you turn that into something? And why weren't they able to do that? And then the other piece is because of the lack of success the Phillies had over the years, how this group of people really captured Philadelphia, the imagination of Philadelphia sports fans. And Philadelphia sports fans still know these folks today. Maybe not all of them by name, but they know who the Whiz Kids are. And they're almost treated as if they won won the World Series. Um, I point out there's a couple of other teams that kind of fit that bill. Maybe the Impossible Dream Red Sox, the 67 are kind of treated that way, and maybe the 59 Go-Go White Sox. But usually, this is unusual. And so it's kind of investigating that as well. And then towards the end of the book, go into the decline in the late 50s, then talk about kind of switch off and go towards, okay, how did Kurt Simmons and Robin Roberts leave the Phillies and what was the rest of their career like? And then closing out with what happened to everybody. So it's kind of a whirlwind look at the team, with this as kind of the linchpin of it, and takes you all the way to when Kurt Simmons died in 2022. So it covers almost 200 years and a couple hundred pages, but uh, it was really fun. I think it's a good and a very interesting story with a lot of uh, interesting characters, and a lot of questions that are raised, and I hope some are answered and some are impossible to answer. What would have happened if they had done things differently? But try to address those things and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of everybody. And I hope people learn something and gives people something to think about. So
Excellent. Thanks for the overview. I'll kick us off, and this is more so an anecdotal question from one of the old salts at the cigar lounge I frequent. He swears that there was a Dodgers fan on the draft board that drafted Kurt Simmons. In your research, did you find any research that supported that?
I didn't run into that. He was in the National Guard. He actually had National Guard service in 49 for a couple of
Okay.
weeks. He and I think it was Bicknell, Charlie Bicknell. I think they both went in 49. So in 50, he that was his National Guard unit, and I don't know that his National Guard unit got called up because of that. I mean, I didn't look into it. I didn't run across it. I'm sure there's a lot of conspiracy theories everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, this team, still beloved in Philadelphia, still remembered by even the casual fans know the name Whiz Kids. Um, but is this team a national, thing? Are the Whiz Kids an exciting club for the nation, or is it really just a local thing? Do they come out of nowhere for the nation?
I think they were big, really a national story throughout the 50s. Um, One of my um, sources, I have a run of Sport Magazine, which has never been digitized, from the first issue to about 1972, I think. And so there's a lot of it was almost a pastime of folks in the 50s saying, why haven't the Whiz Kids repeated? What happened? There's 3 or 4 articles like that where they talk to some of the players anonymously. They were very well represented in the All-Star game throughout the 50s. And so I would say that at least in the 50s, they were uh, a national story. I think time has faded that somewhat. I think baseball fans know them, but whether casual sports fans know them, it's a little different. This is the 75th anniversary this year of it, and they're obviously all gone. But I would say certainly that decade, and they were a national phenomenon. I know the story Bobby Knight, who grew up during that time, was always, I think it was Paul Rogers told me this story that he had talked to Bobby Knight. And Bobby Knight was always proud he could win bar bets by betting everybody he could name the starting lineup for the Phillies, and the one everybody would trip up on was Goliath. And so he was a big fan of the Whiz Kids all his life. And there's talk of players even in the 80s and 90s who were surprised how people remembered them, that I would run across quotes, and they talk about I'm in Portland and I'm hearing stuff about the Whiz Kids. So I
Hmm.
think they caught some imagination of folks, but whether they're certainly not as prominent now as they were in that first decade after winning that pennant.
Great. Well, I won't steal all the time. Rick, you had a question before we began recording. Would you like to ask that again for posterity's sake? You're muted currently.
Oh, there it goes. Dennis, I asked you before before we got started recording, what prompted your interest in this particular team and uh, this particular era of baseball. And I think the group here would be interested in hearing you answer that question again.
Sure. So I had done a biography of Lefty O'Doul, which covered, he had two fantastic seasons, 1929, 1930, single-handedly knocked the Cubs out of the pennant race in 1930 while with the Phillies, and in 1929 had one of the great hitting seasons of all time. Then got traded because the team needed pitching that then they got players that really didn't pan out. So, um, and I think that, and then you mentioned Johnny Evers. I'd forgotten. Yes, he played for the Phillies in 1917, which was actually their last winning season until I think 32, and then they didn't have another winning season until 49. So uh, Evers was on that 1917 team. So I've always kind of, it seems like I keep touching these things, so it kind of sticks in the back of your mind. And then I ran across, I was just showing this before, an old-fashioned general ledger. This is the Phillies general ledger. It's showing backwards because of the way my camera works, but it says PNLC, and it's a handwritten ledger. It doesn't have the payroll records, but it has all their accounts payable and receivable records. So as like their ticket sales things, and there was actually a handwritten note in there detailing a loan they had given to Robin Roberts, I think in 51 or 52, to buy his first house. So little tidbits like that, and I go, okay, well that's interesting. And going through that, I have a bit of financial background being a business official in the school district, so I could make some sense of it, not total, but some, because it's not totally complete. But it covered 1949 to 1952, so it includes, so it shows like World Series receipts, ad sales, TV revenue, things like that, that were some kind of interesting little tidbits that I thought could flesh out the story a little bit, including what they were spending to subsidize their minor league teams, um, bonuses they were paying, so I could kind of verify what the uh, bonuses were, like to Kurt Simmons or Ted Kazansky and some of these folks, and when they were paying them out. And actually, there's even a note in there. Bob Carpenter Jr. loaned the team a note payable for 465,000. So that just, that kind of intrigued me. And then just getting into the story itself, once I got into it, realizing there were a lot of interesting, first of all, the Phillies' history is very colorful. And then coming at it from a different angle where you have a team that's not as successful. Quite often, people are writing about franchises that have tremendous success. And this is one that kind of found a way to become successful, overcoming some odds. Uh, and made it and then couldn't hold it. And so I just thought that was interesting. And of course you have the weight kiss angle and some other things that people do know when you they don't know the weight kiss shooting necessarily, but when you tie it in with the natural, yeah, okay, I got it. So there are some things that are interesting. And then the characters themselves, you had a lot of really interesting characters on that team and some really great players. So
That said, how healthy was the team financially, attendance wise, and that kind of thing? Because obviously, in 1950, the A's were still there and they left town a few years later. I've heard it said by A's devotees that the wrong team left town. But leaving that aside for a bit, how healthy were the Phillies financially?
they were a lot healthier financially than the A's were. Um, the A's and if you remember, the A's and Phillies kind of were peaking toward 1950 about the same time. And then the Phillies had really an excellent season in 49. And there were people thinking that they might challenge as well in 1950, but they fell apart. And the Phillies, the 50 Phillies, they made probably a quarter of a million. I would say the A's lost at probably 300,000 from what I could tell. Uh, the
And
Phillies,
and that factors in the fact that the Phillies are paying the A's rent
yes,
for Shive Park.
yeah. And that's on revenue of about a million and a quarter. So 250,000 is pretty healthy profit at that time. All these numbers sound like nothing now, but it was pretty solid. And the Athletics, their attendance dropped almost 75% from 1949 to 1950. They only drew 300,000 while the Phillies drew about a million one. That was the second year the Phillies had topped a million and it set a new record. They did it in 46 was the first year I think that they topped a million. But this was also when overall attendance had peaked 46, 47, and then it was starting to drop. There were starting to be warning signs at 49 and 50. It really accelerated. The Phillies were one of the few teams that had their attendance increase in 1950. Most teams had major drops, and the minor leagues were really starting to melt away. And they dropped probably by about a third in attendance between like 49 and 52. And so if the Phillies hadn't had to subsidize, they owned 5 minor league teams at the time. So they were pretty deep into that, or they probably would have had a bigger profit. But they were much more healthy than the Athletics.
Wow, interesting. Dixie, you have your hand raised. Go
Yes,
ahead.
I do. Um, since I'm a member of the 19th Century Committee, I probably know 10 times more about the 1890s Phillies than the 1950 Phillies, but I do like stories about the 1950 Phillies. I was wondering, first of all, where did you go first to start assembling information about them? How long did it actually take to write the book? And finally, what person on the team do you think is the most underrated who contributed the most to the winning?
Okay. Let's talk 19th century first, then I'll get to the question because there's some fascinating things there, and I do touch on them. You had a left-handed catcher, Jack Clemens, who was a really good catcher. Of course, I have a little section on Charlie Ferguson, who if people don't know him, you should find out about him. He was still probably one of the best Phillies players. And so anyway, a lot of interesting players there.
A ton
Um,
of hitting and no pitching.
yeah, that was the problem. I think they generally finished in the bottom third in earned run average at the same time they're hitting 400. And they didn't have to, they did that even before Baker Bowl. They were like that. But
If I might interject really quick, I did some research on runs scored per game per decade a while back, starting from 1876 until the present. So the highest scoring team for a decade was the 1930s Yankees, followed by the 1890s Boston Beaneaters, followed by the 1890s Phillies. Of the clubs that were in the top five in this category, only the Phillies didn't win a championship, and it's because the pitching was horrendous. It was terrible. So they scored a lot of runs, they gave up a lot of runs.
yeah. As far as kind of your last piece on underrated, um, Del Ennis was just always underrated, I think. Um, and I think he was so consistent. He had a bad year in 51, but he was a pretty consistent player if you look at his numbers. Um, and I'm not sure people appreciate how good Kurt Simmons was that year. He was actually leading Robin Roberts in wins when he went into the military service. And he probably would have won 22, 23 games if he hadn't gone in because he lost. 2 weeks earlier in the year and then lost the last 3 weeks of the year and still won 17. Uh, he and Roberts probably would have been pretty close because Roberts could have had more rest too, because that was part of the problem there. But everybody seemed to have big moments, which I think is what happens with teams that win. Even people like Jimmy Bloodworth had two or three big games. Bill Nicholson, who was out, was battling diabetes most of the year and then was out in September, had two or three big hits in August, big pinch hit home runs. It just seemed like everybody would have a big game here or there when they needed it, except in September. Then finally Dick Sisler on the last day and Richie Ashburn. So I don't know if that answers your question. Did I miss a part of it?
So how long did it actually take to
Oh,
write the book?
that's difficult to say because I was playing around with two or three different ideas and I kept coming back to this one, but I would play with it and write little pieces on it. This is my first book in 8 years. And I would say if you really took the right, probably a year and a half to 2 years, I would say if I took all of the time and crunched it in. Certainly the last year, I'd really focused in on it and decided this was going to be the next one. But probably about a year and a half to 2 years total.
Did your publisher make any requests or anything as it was going along that you had to get into?
I am of the habit that I don't submit to a publisher till it's almost done because I don't want that to happen. And either it fits and they like it or it doesn't. And so I don't have to have a contract to give me, to propel me into doing it. I do it, because I really want to. And if it's going to work, it's going to work. And so that's kind of been my approach. So by the time it's done, I'm not worrying about deadlines. I'm already kind of done, and at least the structure of it. Now I still need to, I always talk about the first draft is just typing, editing is writing. And so I might still need to do some editing, but I have the structure. I know how it's going to flow. I know what the storyline is and where I'm going to get from A to Z. And I want to have all that kind of set because one, it helps me sell it to a publisher because it's more concrete. And two, then I don't have the pressure of a deadline except for final edits and sprucing it up and do final fact checking and things like that. I generally do 5 or 6 different types of edits. I'll do an edit for fact that's basically fact checking. I'll do another one that's basically, okay, does the flow work? Another one might be more grammatical. Another might be, okay, does the structure work? Is this paragraph in the right place or should it be down towards the end? So, and then another one, I read it aloud to myself. And sometimes you catch things that way. Either something doesn't sound right or you realize when you read it, well, that doesn't sound the way that I meant it to write it.
Yep.
And so I'm really disciplined with that. And I want all that kind of out of the way and not have the pressure of a deadline coming. And so that's why I do it that way.
Funny you should mention Del Ennis because in 1956, it was the first year that I was collecting baseball cards. I was 9. And of course, one of the people in the set was Del Ennis. And I just, I didn't know anything about Del Ennis. I had no rhyme or reason why I should like Del Ennis, but I've always liked Del Ennis for some reason, even though I was in Boston or outside of Boston, and he was a Philadelphia Philly. I just always liked him for God knows what reason, but that's what was going on with me in 1956. I liked him for some reason.
There he is, his 1950
Yep.
Bowman. I went and have collected the 1950 set of the Phillies
Yeah.
in that set. It's a beautiful set. I really
Yes.
like the artwork. And that's the first year of the new Phillies uniform, and it really does pop. It's really interesting.
First, we'll go to Mitch, and then we have a question in the chat. Mitch, go ahead.
Hi. So first of all, I'm looking forward to reading this a lot. I have to say that I have a memory of going to the 25th reunion of the Whiz Kids in 1975 at the Vet. And I got to tell you, as a 9-year-old, they looked like doddering old men walking out there. They were probably in their 40s.
Yeah.
But as a kid, I just remember, my God, these guys must be like 100. Uh, but but anyway, so my question is, so I know your subtitle is about how they changed Philadelphia baseball forever. So could you talk about that and how the impact they had on Philadelphia baseball going forward?
Well, that is the publisher's subtitle. So, you know how that goes, Mitch. I know Mitch. We're in a writers group together, and actually he helped give me some advice on marketing this book a little bit. But I didn't object to it. I tweaked it a little bit. I think, well, one, it led to the it really started the departure of the A's. So it gave the Phillies a baseball monopoly in the town of Philadelphia. I think without that success, that might have taken longer and might have been a battle between which one left. One was going to leave or the other. And them having success and the Athletics falling on hard times, I think that changed Philadelphia baseball, probably the biggest piece of it. And it gave one team a chance in a large market to thrive versus two dividing it. And the other thing is, I think because Philadelphia sports in general had a pretty long dry period, I think they caught the imagination of sports fans and baseball in particular in a way that held on, that the Phillies were able to hold on to that, especially once the Athletics left. So that's kind of the way that I look at it.
Oh, well, thanks. I gave you advice. I hope you didn't take it, whatever advice it was.
It had to do with which publisher to go to.
Oh, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Did you take my advice? I don't even remember.
Yes. Well, I thought you had published with one publisher and it was a different one for one thing, but you just gave me some overall advice, and yeah, I followed it and went back to Nebraska. You didn't tell me to go back to Nebraska, but you told me
Oh,
kind of some things to
oh,
think
well.
about, and I did, and I ended up going back to Nebraska. So
Oh, okay. Well, good luck. I'm looking forward to reading it.
thank you.
Uh, First from the chat, and then we'll get to Rich. Where does the nickname Whiz Kids originate?
Well, Bob Carpenter kind of talked about it. I think the genesis actually is there was a college basketball team in the University of Illinois in the 1940s that was called the Whiz Kids. And I think they were still kind of popular in mind. And then because the team was young, I think I'm not sure that was a conscious decision, but that's the best I could come up with. And then Bob Carpenter in spring of 1950, if you remember, I mean, I'm sure you all know this, that he came up with Blue Jays he was going to replace the name Phillies with Blue Jays, had a contest that Edith Crooks won. And but then there was some backlash, and he said, "Oh no, it'll just be an additional. We'll be the Phillies and the Blue Jays." So after '49, he said, "We're abandoning that." I think Fightin' Phillies or Whiz Kids fit us better. You started seeing Whiz Kids in spring training in the Florida papers in March, and you probably saw Whiz Kids and Fightin' Phillies both quite a bit in 1950. Actually, the theme song that Elliot Lawrence came up with. The cover of the book has Elliot Lawrence and four of the players, Hamner, Jones, Sisler, and Ashburn, at opening day. And Elliot Lawrence wrote the Fightin' Phillies theme song. And so there was kind of a battle between the two, but over time, Whiz Kids has kind of been the one everybody really has stuck with. But at the time, it was really kind of almost a toss-up. They were kind of used interchangeably.
Rich, go ahead.
Uh, I have a comment and a question. Just talking about the earlier stuff with Charlie Ferguson.
Hmm.
I like to dabble with the Hall of Fame stuff. People ask me if you want to describe the Phillies. I said, well, I think Charlie Ferguson may have had the greatest start of any career that never ended up in the Hall of Fame.
Hmm.
And of course, he died. And I said it's been like that for the Phillies basically for other than a few periods, almost their entire history. So it's always seemed to be something with them. But during your research, did you ever come across the name Ron Rosinski? He's from my hometown up here.
No, I
Um,
didn't.
he started in 40, he was signed by the Phillies in 48. He kind of moved through the system fast. He came up in 54, and of course, he blew out his arm. And then he hung around the minors, and he became some of a semi-local legend in the Venezuelan league a couple of
No.
years.
Okay.
But I knew his son, and his son used to say about how when his son remembers hanging out with Richie Ashburn at their
Okay.
house and Robin Roberts and stuff. I didn't know if you ever heard of anything as you were coming through your research.
I had not heard of him, no. Did not run across him.
Right. Thank you.
I could talk a couple of stories that kind of stick out with me. One has to do with the famous throw of Richie Ashburn to home plate to uh, nail Cal Abrams in that ninth inning. Uh, and afterwards, Bert Schotten was talking about how Richie Ashburn never threw out anybody before. How could he play shallow and make that throw? And what was interesting is um, I kind of went through and figured out. So Ashburn had thrown out four players at home plate before that day, including one just 4 days earlier. He'd thrown out Eddie Stanky in a game against the Giants. So Bert Schotten needed to look at his scouting reports a little more, I think. And Ashburn had thrown out a few guys at third, you know, but these were direct plays where he threw a guy out at home, not a relay, you know, not center field to short to home. Um, so I thought that was interesting that you know he's moaning that and you know kind of an exaggeration.
We have a question from Andrew. Andrew, unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Hi, Dennis. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the process that led to Jim Constanti starting the first game of the World Series after being a relief pitcher all year. How that came about and what the reaction at the time was to putting a relief ace out on the mound, especially um, without Kurt Simmons for the series.
Sure, I think so. Constanti had started before, and he'd started actually for Sawyer in Toronto some before he brought him up to Philadelphia. Once he got to Philadelphia, he was a relief pitcher exclusively. But he had started earlier in his career with Cincinnati and Boston before he went back to the minors and started some in the minors and relieved some. And relief pitching really suited him for two reasons. One, he was a guy who never felt pressure. He always said the pressure's on the other guy. Casey Stengel say he's comes to the mound. He's like a guy walking out to get the paper at the corner store. He just never seems perturbed. He was older. He'd been around. He was 33, and he was one of two pitchers by that time. Were probably the only two pitchers that Sawyer had confidence in, and he just used Robin Roberts. Robin Roberts, when he pitched that last day, I think had pitched 4 times in 8 days and was really running on fumes. And then that last game was a 10 inning game that he pitched. So he was looking for something different that might throw the Yankees off. And Constanti, he knew wasn't going to be perturbed by it. If anything, he was excited about it. People were surprised. It kind of came out of left field. And, you know, Sawyer kind of pointed to another great Philadelphia moment when Howard Emke pitched in 1929 when Connie Mack used him, and he kind of pointed at that as a parallel. But Constanti was unusual. He didn't throw hard. threw a lot of breaking pitches, had an Undertaker friend who was his pitching coach, personal pitching coach, and he didn't rattle. He threw strikes, and he thought it was something that the Yankees hadn't seen, and it did work. It's just the Phillies didn't hit, but he only gave up 1 run in 8 innings. He pitched really well, and he had pitched. Yeah, I think the other thing is there were at least 3 or 4 games that he pitched in 1950 in relief, where he pitched between 8 and 10 innings in relief in some games. So he knew he could last that amount of time. And so I think those were some of the, and he had started in his life. It wasn't like he'd never started a game before. So I think those were some of the reasons, but it was a surprise to people. There were a lot of people who Kurt Simmons could have been activated from what I can tell. He was on leave. He was at the World Series. He threw batting practice, and there were people even on the team who thought, you know, why don't you activate Simmons? Well, Simmons himself, from what I could tell, was reluctant because he thought there could be criticism that here he is on leave military, he should be serving, and here he is pitching in a World Series. He also was cognizant that he would take someone else's spot on the roster. And I think Sawyer was looking at it as kind of a no-win situation, that if he pitched well, he'd get criticized, and he hadn't pitched in 3 weeks. And if it didn't do well, then that might hurt because Simmons was still a young guy. He had come out in 47 and pitched the final game of the 47 season because of the way the bonus rules were. And then 48 and 49, he had really rough times. It was the first time in his life he'd faced a situation where he wasn't dominating. He had been much bigger prospect than Roberts, and at the time that the two signed, and he had dominated competition his whole life from the time he was 13, 14 years old. He was throwing no hitters in high school. He was playing American Legion ball. He played in the big game in New York, the Esquire game. And Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb had both taken him aside and said, you should give up pitching and become a hitter. You're too good a hitter to do pitching. Everybody saw that he was going to be a star. And then he struggled. And it took him 2 years to get over that. And this was his first successful year. And I'm not sure Sawyer wanted to put him in that situation. So for those reasons, I think then it came down to Constanti or Roberts. Russ Meyer had pitched some, but he was battling elbow problems all year. Ken Heinzelman eventually pitched game 3 because there was really no one left to turn to, but he'd only won 3 games all year after winning 17 the year before. So there just weren't a lot of options that he had. The parallels to 64 are there. You had the same thing where you were down to basically 2 pitchers that Gene Mauch, trusted, Chris Short and Jim Bunning. It was kind of the same thing for Eddie Sawyer in September in 1950, except the Phillies pulled it out on the last day in 50, and they didn't pull it out in 64.
I'd like to circle back to Del Ennis, and Del Ennis doesn't captivate the fan base like Richie Ashburn or Robin Roberts does today, but Del Ennis was a power threat. Del Ennis was a good baseball player. He probably has a okay Hall of Fame case, but one of the questions that gets asked is, why did Del Ennis get booed so much? Here's
I
a
know, that
local
is a
guy.
good question.
Here's a local guy, and he's made well in the big leagues, and he's a driving force for this club that's, one of the most impactful in club history. So I've read things online. None of it is conclusive. I assume you didn't come across anything conclusive. Does it begin before the 50 season, during or after? And what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's really after. And he had, I don't know whether it was in 51, he hurt his back, and he never really got going in 51. And as the season went on, it got worse. And I think he only had 2 home runs the last 2 months of the season. I think he had 15 for the year, which was about half of what he'd been doing and about half of what he did later. And I don't know whether it kind of started there and he was kind of part of the disappointment that fans had in the Phillies. Remember, they didn't have Curt Simmons coming back in 51. And so there was that piece. And you had Bob Miller hurt his back in 50 and was never really the same. And Bubba Church had that eye injury, although he pitched pretty well in 51. So I don't know whether it was that. I could never find anything conclusive either. I don't know what it was because it's sort of like Jackie Jensen in Boston, the same thing, where you drive in a lot of runs every year, play well. It's like people just expected more, I guess. And I think some guys just end up with that label. And it's just as difficult to pinpoint that as to who has star power as athletes. There's athletes that have better numbers than others, but some they've got charisma or they've got something. He must have had something that Phillies fans just brought out the booze. There's no reason if you're looking at the numbers. Now, I never saw him play, but he would do spectacular things. I mean, he made at least two barehanded catches in the outfield uh, in his career. 52, I think he robbed Mays going into the alley, had stumbled and made a barehand catch in the alley in center field or in right center. So I don't know. He's to me he's overall a very underrated player.
I think we can chalk it up to sports fans are illogical, and if that's the true statement, then what does that make Philadelphia fans? Beyond. A quick hypothetical, while everybody else thinks of another question if they have any. Let's say the Phillies win the World Series in 1950. Uh, does the does that change anything afterwards? Does the downfall still happen? Do they continue that success?
My gut would say no, because I think that would have only reinforced them to continue doing what they did, which they did anyway. I mean, the real problem with them, I talk about in the 40s, they underwent a certain strategy and it worked, and then it didn't. And the problem was when it didn't in 50, it was also at a time when the finances of the game were on the downturn too. So when they weren't successful, it hit them even harder financially because the minor league teams started being a real drain on them. And then they weren't making it up at the major league level. So that cut into what they could do. Um, and I think by the time they just didn't recognize the reality, and they weren't alone in this. There were other teams that had the same thing where they just didn't realize the reality that April 15th, 1947 brought, and that it changed the game. And then you get further along, and they're just trying to do the same thing. I mean, they're signing Fred Van Dusen, Mac Burke, Kazansky, Casagrande, none of them really pan out. And in the 40s, they did. They signed Simmons and they signed Lopata and they signed Roberts and they were signing bonus players and it was working and they kept trying to do the same thing. And then by the time Roy Hamey shows up and they start looking at minority ball players, that's been picked clean, you know. And so, I talk about maybe if they had jumped past that idea and planted their flag in the Caribbean as the Dodgers were doing and the Washington Senators, maybe they could have made a beachhead there, picked up some players, and maybe by the late 50s they'd have been rebounding. The other thing that was interesting though is they did have some players that started panning out in like 57. They had Jack Sanford and they had several players. And then it was the Whiz Kid players who had off years. That was the year Roberts loses 22 games, and Hamner's hurt, and Jones is hurt, and Ashburn has an off year. If those guys had had decent years, they might have won. And they were actually in first place for a couple of days in the summer of '57, and then kind of collapsed. So they 57 was kind of okay. Now the farm system's finally starting to produce, and but then the Whiz Kids who weren't that old, you're talking about 30 probably, late 20s, early 30s, they were fading then. So they had off years, and so it just never came back together for them. But I think it would have. My gut tells me it just reinforced what they did anyway, because now they had success, bigger success. They kind of had an excuse because they lost Simmons, they had injuries to Church and Miller, and so they could kind of extend. And the World Series had to be a big disappointment because the other thing is there were no off days. So that World Series, 2 days later, 72 hours, that was over. You know, uh, so it was over, before they had a chance to even enjoy it, I think.
Dixie, you have your hand raised.
Yes. Since you did in-depth studies of everybody, was Pudd'nhead Jones a real Pudd'nhead?
um, I will say this. There was no one in that general ledger who got more salary advances than Willie Jones. um, I did run across a story where, in '54, Bob Carpenter was caught uh, surveilling his players. He had a private detective tailing them, and the guy was supposed to be tailing Willie Jones, but he tailed Granny Hamner by mistake. And Stan Lapata, I heard an interview with Stan Lapata, and he said what he couldn't figure out is not only was the guy picked the wrong guy to follow, this genius detective, but why is Carpenter having his players followed in Philadelphia versus on the road? He could never figure out what he's doing there. But yeah, Jones, I think, was a little bit of that, but he was also an excellent third baseman. There's another guy I think is really underrated. If you're looking at some of the best third basemen in the '50s, he'd have to be in the conversation there. Both, a very solid offensive player and an excellent defensive player.
Anybody else have follow-ups or additional questions? If I might throw a wrench into this a little bit, Dennis, a little bit of a curveball. Lefty O'Doul plays 2 fantastic years in Philadelphia and then gets sold off.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you can comment quickly on Lefty coming to Philly, his season here, and his departure.
So Lefty had a weird career. He started out as a pitcher and actually came up to the Yankees. He started his career kind of late. He really didn't start till he was about 19. He didn't play a lot and played in San Francisco, and then got signed by the Yankees, who had a presence out there. And so he was a pitcher for them who rarely played. It was almost like the best parallel is take Tom Qualters in the '50s, who sat on the bench for 2 years and I think got in one game. That was Lefty O'Doul with the Yankees. He played a little more than that, but like 4 games and 10 games. And part of it was that he got on the wrong side of Miller Huggins. Huggins wanted him to become an outfielder, and from what I understand, and he resisted it. I think he was stubborn. He loved the spotlight, and he thought the center of the diamond was where the spotlight was. So he didn't give up pitching until it was obvious he was never going to make it. He went back to the minors in 1924 and then became a terror as a hitter. The Cubs bought him in '26. Actually, William Wrigley, personally signed him to the Cubs, but Joe McCarthy didn't like him, farmed him out. So he spent 2 more years in the Coast League playing probably at a major league level, but he was stuck in the minors. And at that time, you weren't, there was no free agency. There's no way to leave. He got back to San Francisco, and Charlie Graham always told him, "I'm not going to hold you back from going to the majors if you can." But by this time, he's 31 years old. So he gets drafted by the New York Giants. plays a year as a platoon because John McGraw would not play him against left-handed pitching. So the Phillies are looking for a hitter. So they trade another outfielder who's about the same age, and they just swap outfielders. But the guy that the Phillies traded was considered a little better overall player. O'Doul was never a good defensive player. He just didn't concentrate on it, and his arm wasn't great because he'd hurt it pitching. As a pitcher, I think one New York writer said he had a magnificent curveball that fooled everybody once, but never fooled anybody twice. And that was kind of his downfall. So he comes to the Phillies, and Bert Schotten is the manager, and he plays him every day. The same Bert Schotten who later lost to the Phillies in that big game in '50. And so O'Doul really took it out on McGraw. He hit a home run and then is yelling at McGraw, see, I told you I can hit left-handers and stuff, and had, like I said, two fantastic seasons. The second year, he took his revenge on McCarthy for dropping him in 26, while William Wrigley is sitting in the outfield in Philadelphia because he was a Philadelphia native, listening to all the Phillies fans razz him for losing out on having O'Doul. As O'Doul, I think he was having ankle problems and shin splints and was mostly pinch hitting the last month of that second season because he just couldn't play. And he had two big home runs, one a walk-off that basically knocked the Cubs out of the pennant race. And McCarthy was fired a week later and replaced with Roger Hornsby before the end of the 1930 season. Then the Phillies needed pitching. O'Doul by that time is about to turn 34, and it wasn't necessarily the wrong move for them to make, but they really didn't get anything because they also didn't have money to spend. And this was right after William Baker died. I think he was traded just before Baker died because Baker died of the winter meetings in December 1930. So I think he had traded him a couple of weeks before, but they just didn't get much for him. I think Jumbo Elliott and Clyde Dudley or something like that, which household names, I'm sure, as Phillies fans, you know all about them.
Both jerseys.
If you don't know about them, that tells you how bad a trade that was.
Yeah. Thanks. Rich, you have another question?
Yeah. We've discussed this a lot with friends and stuff. Since you started at the beginning, do you think the Phillies ownership as a collection for the last 150 years has been some of the worst owners collectively in baseball in 150 years?
Well, okay. So if you kind of break it into segments, I think so you had Al Reach and John Rogers, and I think they were pretty good and up till about 1900. And then you had a group of owners that came in that weren't, well, they either had health, there were two of them that had health problems and died, and you had others that didn't really want to run the team, and then you had one guy who was Horace Fogel, who was kind of a figurehead, and he was trying to do some things, but he didn't really own the team. He was having to pay interest on a loan to a guy who was involved with the Cubs, the Taft family, actually the half brother of the president of the United States at that time. And so then you went through that, and then William Baker took over when his cousin had bought the team and died within a few months. So Baker took it over, and Baker he stubbornly held on. Now, Fogel built most of the team that won in 1915. Baker inherited most of those players. It was Fogel that got Grover Cleveland Alexander and got Eparixi and got Gabby Cravath and all the core of that team. And so Baker inherited that. And then you had the Federal League that kind of rated the Phillies, and Baker wasn't willing to pay. And then he basically gave away Alexander and Killefer, the catcher, after the 1917 season. And he made one good trade, got Cy Williams, who was a good pickup. And then really until he got O'Doul, there wasn't a whole lot that they that they got in the 1920s. And he was an absent owner. He was in New York most of the time. His secretary, who ended up owning the team with her husband, the Nugents, really ran the team unless he was in town. He would come in town once in a while, but he was really an absentee owner most of that time. And then the Nugents, I think, could have been good owners. They just didn't have money. And so I think, and then that brings you up to Cox, who was his own interesting thing. But he at least, there were some things he did. He did change the process of, the habit of the Phillies was to always sell off their best players. And he stopped that. And he definitely said the aim of this team is to win, which was different versus just survive, which was basically what was true probably for the 2 decades before that. And then the Carpenters came in, and I think the key for them is they had the money and they had the patience. They bought it in 44. They didn't win until 50, but they believed in their plan and they stuck with it, getting these young guys, letting them play in the minors, building that team up as a core. And that was really good. And it's just a little short-sightedness in the 50s, but they came back in the 60s and were pretty solid, really, from the mid 60s to today, with a few downturns. I mean, the 72 team was bad, and but generally they've been pretty solid with Carpenter and then the Giles and all that. I don't know. I would be interested in your guys' perspective. You lived through it, but that's just from the outside what I would say.
Well,
But none of them are banned.
Not now.
well, the reason I asked that was because even with the newer owners, like I know everybody loved Ruley Carpenter, but the biggest vote in the history, one of the biggest votes in recent history of National League was about the DH. And I saw the interview. They did a small documentary. Not only didn't Ruley Carpenter go to the meeting, he couldn't even be found. And then he's watching the video and he's giggling about how his fishing trip went well that day. Like he didn't really bother him. And then, of course, Giles, I think he was just a carnival guy. I mean, he was good promotions, but I don't know. He had that one good year. And, and then I think even Montgomery, I think he spent a lot of time trying to correct what Giles did instead of they've never been able to sustain anything. They win one year and 80 was good. And then
that's true.
2008, they've never been able to, it's never seemed to kick on. And even when Middleton took over, his first hire is McPhail. That didn't go well. It just seems like they never, even when they have decent owners, they never seem to quite get it right.
You may have something there. Maybe it is, so like you have teams that always seem to have great pitching for 100 years. I guess the Phillies have bad ownership. That's kind of, or inconsistent ownership is kind of their history.
Hopefully we're turning a corner.
Yeah.
I'll conclude with this question because we're just after the hour. And it's a question from the chat, and it is, was part of the demise of the 1950s Phillies due to the Dalton gang?
Well, I mean, I've heard that. I think that there's some of that. I think you had some guys who had career years. That happens. Dick Sisler never had a year like he had in 50. You had Constanti never was. He had some okay years, but that was kind of an out of this world and out of nowhere season. And then you didn't have Simmons in 51 and no one to come in behind him. Miller looked like he would have been a real thing, and he got hurt, and he didn't really ever pan out. But you look at that first half of that season before he got hurt, he looked like he was going to be a star. And so I think there was some injuries that happened. The pitching staff wasn't that young, really, outside of Roberts and Simmons. A lot of them were over 30. A good chunk of them were. And they had some guys that they didn't use much that were younger, or they had in the minors for a lot of the years. Steve Ridzik was a guy who I think he had a broken kneecap in spring training or something, so he only pitched once. Um, but yeah, I think yeah, but there was kind of an element of some guys who got them who were there was a reason maybe Carpenter was following them. And then you had some of them, yeah, Eddie Sawyer just didn't, he kind of lost the team. He wasn't very communicative. He was very quiet, didn't talk a lot. And that worked okay in 1950. But now you've got guys who, okay, now I've had some success. And young people getting success sometimes is tougher to manage, you know, uh, and a little tougher to maneuver. And he just kind of was always leaving players on their own. I mean, I had interviewed Ed Sinicki quite a few years ago, and he talked about Eddie Sawyer never talked to anybody, and he never said anything, and I never understood why I didn't really get a chance to play. Sinicki played in 49 and 51. He would have played in 50. He would have been called up, and then he hurt his knee, and they had called up Jackie Mayo instead. In September, but when Nicholson went down. So I think it was a combination of Sawyer not adjusting his managerial style. I think it was the pitching staff just being depleted because of age and injuries. And it was also some people had those one big years. You had a third baseman, a second baseman who basically learned how to play those positions in the major leagues. You had a first baseman playing left field. You had another first baseman who didn't hit for power at all. Fantastic first baseman, but that is an oddball lineup a little bit. And Semenuk got hurt in 50 and wasn't quite the same in 51 and then got traded. So, and he had a great year in 50. So I think, and then Ennis got hurt early in 51. So it was just, I think it's like a lot of teams. You just have, it's not one thing. It's a bunch of things that kind of conspire to bring a team down.
All right. Dennis, thanks so much for your time this evening. Everyone, thanks for joining. This was one of our better chats, I think. Some deep questions and some fantastic authoritative answers. So thanks everyone involved.
Thank you for having me.
And don't forget to pick up your book. Dennis, you want to tell us where we can pick it up and the full name of the book?
Sure. It's the Whiz Kids, how the 1950 Phillies took the pennant, lost the World Series, and changed Philadelphia baseball forever. You can get it anywhere books are sold. So you can get it on Amazon directly from the publisher. And I have a few books if people want to contact Matt, I guess. And if you want
Sure.
one, I'll sign them, give them to you at my cost. And happy to do that. You can, Barnes and Noble has them. You can, if they don't have them, you can certainly, they're available to them so they can get them on the shelf if they don't have them. Or you can get them online. So pretty much anywhere books are sold.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
All right.
Thanks, Dennis.